Serious topic on tonight, but I'm thankful for our speaker on tonight, and I had an opportunity to meet him at what's called Kevin's Song Conference, and he gave his presentation, and he pulled me in 100%. So I said at that point in time, I said, I've got to have him come back and speak to our parents as well as to our students. So we're working on that presentation as well. So I'm just giving a quick introduction to Kevin. Kevin is the executive director of NAMI, Michigan. NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It is the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization dedicated to building lives for millions of Americans affected by mental illness. A retired businessman, Kevin joined NAMI as a volunteer in 2011 after his oldest son, Dominique, was diagnosed with a mental illness in late 2007 and was lost to suicide in 2010. After serving on NAMI's Michigan Board of Directors as NAMI's Walk chairperson, of which I participated a couple weeks ago, it was really nice, for 2 years, and as board vice president for 2 years, Kevin accepted the role as executive director in 2014. So he told me not to read the whole bio, so I'm going to be obedient to what he told me to do. And then with no further ado, let's receive Kevin Fisher.
Good evening, everybody. How are you?
Good.
I know you could be somewhere else tonight, so I want to thank you in advance for taking the time to be here, because this is really important. It's not just important to me, it's something that should be important to all of us. And I'm going to start with a quick video that tells you a little bit about who I am and how I got here, and then we're going to have a nice conversation. And if you want, you can move closer. I promise I'm not going to ask you any questions that, or anything that'll scare you off. But let's do this.
In today's Amy's Angels, July is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, but one local father fights year-round to bring attention to this growing health crisis. He lost his son to suicide, and now he's working to stop the stigma so one day it doesn't happen to anyone else.
Had an ability to make everyone feel important. He was the kid that would come sit with the kid by himself at the lunch table or on the school bus.
Dominic Fisher was the guy everybody loved, a good student, a three-sport athlete at Detroit Catholic Central High School. He could do everything well, but he could not live with the stigma of being diagnosed with a mental illness.
The primary reason I feel we lost Dominic was due to stigma.
Dominique, like many others, did not want people to know he was battling mental illness and taking medication. So at the age of 23, he stopped taking his meds and going to therapy. And shortly after, he started to self-medicate with marijuana and alcohol. 3 months later, his parents' worst nightmare.
On June 27th of 2010, that journey came to an end because we lost Dominic to suicide.
Since Dominique's death, his father Kevin, a former businessman, has made it his life's work to educate others and stop the stigma surrounding mental illness. He is now the executive director of the Michigan chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. The behavioral health and suicide prevention advocate works year-round to help others. His efforts highlighted in July, which is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month.
In the African American community, there's a great mistrust of the medical community. In the African American community, the stigma of mental illness is you're crazy, you're less than, and we have a tendency to lean more on our faith than treatment.
One of Kevin's newest job titles is president and CEO of EverybodyVersusStigma.com. It's a website where you can help fight stigma by buying and sporting some really cool clothing. The idea, born at one of his annual NAMI walks and developed in the basement of his house, is now reaching people across the country with a life-saving message.
We really plan to change the culture because we're really talking about a culture change. We want people to be more comfortable seeking help. And the way we do that is by normalizing the conversation.
What's really great? 100% of the profits from EverybodyVersusStigma.com support the Dominique Fisher Memorial Foundation, which raises funds, awareness, and provides access to resources that support individuals and families living with mental illness.
And it's all about increasing awareness and eliminating the stigma so people will seek the help that they need. We know that stigma is the leading barrier that prevents people from taking the very first step to getting the help that they need.
And here's how you...
So that's a little bit about me and the journey. A little more that I'd like to share with you is this is home for me. My son Dominique, we moved back here in 1997. And so Dominique grew up here in the Wayne-Westland school district. He attended Franklin Middle School, and he ultimately went to Detroit Catholic Central High School, which is a whole different story, but he wanted to be here at John Glenn. He participated in WYA sports, playing baseball, basketball, football, did a little bit of all of it. And this is a community he loved and my family loved, so it's really nice to be back here today. Just wish it could have been under different circumstances. So, Mr. Beebe told you a little bit about me. This is a little bit more. I wear a lot of hats as it relates to mental health in the state of Michigan, and I do it because it's important. The jobs and the titles that I hold are not to make myself feel good, it's not to make me feel important, it's not to impress you. It's because the work needs to be done. And when my wife asked me why I continue to take on more roles, my response is simply, if somebody else was going to do it, they'd already be doing it. And so the work is really important to me. That particular interview, that tape that I played, shows one side, and it was specifically produced during Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, which is July every year. But when I say everybody, I mean everybody, because mental illness does not discriminate, and neither does stigma. But stigma varies by community and culture. And I want us to have a really honest conversation tonight, so I'm going to move through the slides somewhat quickly so we can have Q&A and just have a nice conversation. But in addition to being the executive director for the National Alliance on Mental Illness of Michigan, I also have the privilege of serving as the president of an organization called CIT International, which stands for Crisis Intervention Team Training International. It's an organization where we train law enforcement officers and behavioral health professionals how to help people who are experiencing a behavioral health crisis. Don't harm them, don't take them to jail, but get them to help. Because unfortunately, a recent Department of Justice study showed that 25% of the people shot and killed by law enforcement in the United States between 2015 and 2020 were people who had a diagnosed mental illness. And we know that there's probably equally as many that were undiagnosed or unknown at the time. And we have to provide care and treatment for people who live with behavioral health care disorders, not jail them, not criminalize them, and certainly not hurt them. And so I'm proud to serve in the capacities that I do. I happen to serve on the Governor's Suicide Prevention Commission, the Mental Health Diversion Council, a number of boards, but again, I do the work because the work needs to be done and it's important. And at the end of the day, my goal, my prayer, is to improve the quality of life for everybody in the community. And I think we do that if we take care of our most vulnerable citizens. So if you're not familiar with NAMI, and we've got a number of pamphlets, NAMI is the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization that is purely dedicated to building better lives for anyone affected by mental illness. Not just people who live with diagnoses, but for their family members, caregivers, and the community at large, because one of the, and it's weird to say this, one of the benefits that came out of the pandemic is that we're talking more about the importance of our mental health and mental illness. More celebrities and athletes and actors and actresses are talking about their experience. And that's what we need to do, because the most significant thing we can do to eliminate the stigma is to normalize the conversation. And to normalize the conversation, you have to have a conversation. You have to start talking about it. So people like my son will be much more comfortable seeking help when they need it and continuing their help when they need it, instead of being shamed and stopping their treatment because they're worried about what somebody else has to say. So you heard a lot in the last few years, again, and I'll just go back to 2019, 2020 when we entered the pandemic, and you hear people say all the time, you are not alone as it relates to mental illness. You're not. Over 66 million Americans are impacted by mental illness every year. That's more people that'll be diagnosed with cancer, diabetes, heart disease combined. But we don't talk about mental illness because we're afraid of it. 1 in 5 adults, 1 in 6 kids between the ages of 6 and 17 are impacted by mental illness every year. But we don't always get them the help that they need. One of the myths about mental illness is that it's a choice, that it's a weakness of character. And for people of faith, it's a weakness of faith. And I work with lots of faith leaders, and it doesn't matter if you're Catholic, Baptist, Jewish, Muslim. I work with lots of faith leaders, and we all share that same problem. People of faith tend to think that if I only believed, or I've had faith leaders tell me mental illness is a curse put on you by God. It can only be relieved by God, the laying of hands. I've even had people talk to me about exorcisms. Mental illness is not a choice. Mental illness is a medical diagnosis that requires treatment, just like heart disease and cancer and anything else. And we have to remove that stigma so we can encourage people who are living with a mental illness to get the help that they need. I'm glad that we're talking more about mental illness since the pandemic, but I'm also a little concerned because I think the terms get blended from time to time. There's a difference between mental health and mental illness. We all have mental health. Mental health has to do with our overall well-being, but we don't all have mental illness. Mental illness is a medical diagnosis, and it can be treated. And we don't know all of the causes for mental illness. Sometimes it can be hereditary, sometimes it can be triggered by trauma. You know, we talk a lot about, use the term PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder a lot. And whenever we have those conversations, we tend to talk about active military or veterans. But guess what? We all experience PTSD. Is there trauma going on in the house? Is there trauma going on in school? Are you being bullied? Mental illness can be triggered by substance use. There are many, many triggers for mental illness. But the one is, it's not a choice. And if you don't remember anything else I say tonight, understand mental illness is not a choice. It is a medical diagnosis that deserves the same respect and treatment as any other illness. I'm glad to be here tonight because I want to share a lot of data with you, and I don't want you to get hung up on the statistics because they're available online. And these are real statistics. These are not my opinions. You can Google this stuff. You can go to the Center for Disease Control website. You can go to the NAMI website and find that these are real numbers. 50% of all lifetime cases of mental illness onsets by the age of 14. Now keep in mind, I already said over 60 million Americans are affected by mental illness every year. 50% onsets by the age of 14, 75% by the age of 24. It is absolutely imperative that we help our young people understand it is okay not to be okay. It is okay to raise your hand and say, hey, mom, dad, I'm not quite feeling well from the neck up. And for us as parents, when we notice dramatic changes in our children's behavior, whether it's increased substance use, whether it's becoming more withdrawn, engaging in more risky behavior, there are lots of signs and symptoms of early warning signs of mental illness. We need to act. One of the biggest mistakes we make, and again, it is because of the fear of what we don't understand, we will see our loved ones' behavior change, and we know something's going on, but we just keep looking the other way and hoping tomorrow will be okay. Tomorrow it won't be so bad. He or she's just depressed. They'll be okay tomorrow. If you see these things consistently, act upon it. Act as if your child came home limping or bleeding, you would have no problem saying, you know what, we need to take you to urgent care, or we need to schedule a doctor's appointment. Do the same thing for their mental health. If you think they're struggling, if you see their grades dropping, if you see significant changes in their behavior, if you wouldn't be afraid to go get them evaluated for another physical injury, why be afraid to take them and have a mental health evaluation? Nobody's business, and believe it or not, nobody's gonna know unless you tell them. 37% of young people between the ages of 14 and 21 who are diagnosed with a mental illness will drop out of school. As a matter of fact, mental illness, depression, and anxiety in particular are the #1 causes for dropout in the United States. I'm not gonna hit on all these statistics, but I'll talk about the ones on the far ends. Almost 17% of young people in the United States between 6 and 17 experience a mental health issue in a given year, not just the year 2020. That's a pretty consistent number. 74% of students tell us they're stressed to the point that they're unable to cope. Stress, and that's not just bullies. Sometimes they're stressed because they're trying to live up to our expectations. Sometimes they're struggling socially at school. There's a lot of reasons for that, but almost 75% of young people tell us, I'm stressed so bad I can't function. The statistic that concerns me greatly is the last one here. Last year, 19% of high school students told us they seriously considered suicide. 19%. And what's more scary about that is pre-pandemic, it was, and I'm afraid to say this, it was only 17%. So we're talking about it more, but it's not getting better. 70% of young people in the juvenile justice system has a mental illness, but we label them bad kids. And I said I wasn't gonna ask you a question. You don't have to move up front, but I'll ask a rhetorical question. Who knows what is considered the largest mental health treatment facility in the state of Michigan? Anybody? Nope. It's the Wayne County Jail. And we're not just gonna pick on Detroit or Michigan, because if you go to Ohio, it's the Cuyahoga County Jail. If you go to Illinois, it's the Cook County Jail. If you go to California, it's the Los Angeles County Jail, and so on and so on. How did prisons and jails become our de facto mental health treatment facilities? And the truth be told, nobody's getting effective mental health treatment in jail. Could you imagine having cancer and say, hey, the best place I can get treatment is the county jail? It doesn't make sense. It's a line item on a budget. And so we have to take care of our most vulnerable citizens in our communities. 45%, only about 45% of adults in the United States that need mental health treatment receive it. That's less than half. Over 50 million adults are diagnosed with mental illness every year. Less than half get treatment. I'm a mental health advocate. I've dedicated my life to destigmatizing and fighting for the rights of people who live with mental illness. But I have to be honest when I do that too. Untreated mental illness can be dangerous. I will say that again. Untreated mental illness can be dangerous. We've seen it. We've seen people who said, my son Dominique was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, which means he had voices in his head telling him things that weren't true. I've engaged with a lot of people who said, the voices in my head told me to hurt my mom, told me to hurt my little sister, told me to go to a school and hurt people. We have to be proactive about mental health care. We can't just keep looking the other way and hoping that it goes away. You know, the saying now is, if you know something, say something. I'm gonna go further. If you notice a change with the mental health of your loved one, don't just say something, do something. Pick up the phone and call somebody and get them the help that they need. That's what we need to do. In the United States, there's on average an 11-year delay between the onset of mental health symptoms and treatment. 11 years. And there are lots of reasons for that. None of them are good. Yes, we have a shortage of behavioral health care professionals. Yes, the system is underfunded. Yes, we don't have enough psychiatric beds. We have a lot of issues. But another part of the problem is stigma. We know our loved ones are affected, and we don't take them to get help when we see that they need help. We wait until they're in crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to avert crisis. We need to prevent crisis. Don't wait until a person is a danger to themselves or others to get them help. Because again, I'll say it again, mental illness is a medical diagnosis. And like any other medical diagnosis, the earlier you treat it, the better the potential outcomes. If you are diagnosed with cancer at stage 1, your odds of survival are much better than if you ignore it until stage 4. Mental illness is no different. Almost 42% of the veterans in the United States are diagnosed with at least a mental illness and/or substance use disorder. You know, when I first became an advocate, I went to a veterans mental health symposium. And it was the first time that I had heard that in the United States, on average, we lose 22 veterans a day to suicide. 22 a day. And it made me sick. Because how can the people who fight for our freedom, and I value the quality of life that I have, how can we not be there to help them when they need us? So I wear everybody versus stigma everywhere I go. And I do it on purpose because it's a conversation starter. Many people want to have this conversation, but they're afraid to get it started. And the first question I'm often asked is, well, what is stigma? Stigma is simply a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. It's making somebody feel bad for their situation. It's making them feel less than. It's making them feel like it was their fault. They chose that. And I mentioned before, mental illness does not discriminate. It doesn't care if you're black, white, rich, poor, gay, straight, Republican, Democrat, urban, suburban, rural. Mental illness does not care, doesn't discriminate. Neither does stigma. But stigma does vary by community and culture. The stigma associated with mental illness in the Caucasian community is very different than it is in the African American community. It's very different than it is in the Latino community or the Muslim community or communities of faith. It is very different. And I make that point because we have to be honest about this so we can truly meet people where they are. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to this. If one of the things I mentioned before, I learned so much from Dominique on this journey, and one of them was I always wanted to make him come up here. For example, Dominique was 20 years old when he was diagnosed. He was 23 when he passed. And Dominique was a very high-functioning young man. He had a 3.8 grade point average, great social skills, and all of those things. And truly was very little trouble to his mom and I. But one of my frustrations as a caregiver was every morning I have to remind him not only to take his medicine, but to say, you gotta get up and take a shower, brush your teeth, clean your room, those things. And as a father, it was very frustrating for me to say, why am I reminding a 22-year-old man that he has to brush his teeth every day? I didn't get it. It was the way his brain was functioning. It wasn't that he was resisting. It wasn't that he wanted to be nasty. It was the way, it was a symptom of the illness. And we would argue. We would be yelling, because I was like, why can't you remember to brush your teeth? And then one day it dawned on me, you're trying to make him be up here. Right now he's not there. And you have to meet him where he is. And that's just the reality of it. And we have to do that, again, by culture. Because cultures see this differently. And again, I'm not just talking about racial ethnicity. I'm talking about men and women see mental illness differently, people of faith versus folks who are not, gay, straight. When I say culture, it's a lot. I work with people in law enforcement. Cops listen to cops. Vets listen to vets. Kids like to listen to kids. We have to be willing to make the adjustment instead of saying, I have the answer, do it my way. It's not that simple. Prior to the pandemic, there was a study done, and in that study, 75% of people we studied who lived with a diagnosis of mental illness told us they felt that they were victims of stigma. Even though we're talking more about it, now post-pandemic, it's 87% of the people we interviewed said they feel that they're victims of stigma. So again, the numbers are going the wrong way, and it's not because we're not talking enough about it, it's because we're not doing enough. People need to feel that they're not alone, because I can tell you, going along this journey with my son and even with myself, you can tell me I'm not alone all you want to, but when I'm the person who's living with the mental illness, or when I'm the caregiver, I assure you, you feel very alone. Family and friends go away. Dominique was doing very well in his treatment until people found out what he was being treated for, and it changed. And I tell people, and I'm very blunt, and I don't mean to be triggering to anybody about this, my son's death certificate said he died by suicide. Stigma killed my son. Dominique was doing very well in his treatment. He was going to treatment 4 days a week. He was exercising. He was doing all of those things that we asked of him in his recovery. But when family and friends found out, it wasn't with malice. Again, it is because we're afraid of what we don't understand. But people turned away. And his friends weren't his friends anymore. And it hurt him. And as a father, it hurt me to watch my son, who had been a good kid. If my son was a jerk, I would have understood. But Dominique was, as I described him in the video. And for people to turn away from him was hurtful to him, and it was hurtful to me to watch. And so he stopped taking his medication. And one day in early 2010, I was doing his laundry, and I found a small bag of marijuana in his pants pocket. And I said, what's with the marijuana? Because I am very anti-drug. And he said, well, Dad, the marijuana helps make the voices go away. And I said, yeah, but so did the prescription medication you were on. And with tears in his eye, he said, I would rather people think I'm high than for them to know that I take medication for mental illness. 3 months later, my son was gone. That was it. So let's talk a little bit about suicide. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for young people between the ages of 10 and 14 in the United States. And that is a consistent number. And I am really grateful to the superintendent and Mr. Beebe for allowing me to be here tonight, because guess what? 11 years ago, when I first started this work, not this school district, but others that I approached, they said, no, you can't come in here and talk about mental illness. Because if you talk about mental illness, you can't separate it from the conversation about suicide. And they said, you will plant the seed in kids' head for suicide. This has been a consistent number for decades. Second leading cause of death in the United States for our children. And I said, I'm not planting a seed. That seed's been planted and bearing fruit for decades. And what we know is really the more we talk about it, the greater the opportunity to reduce suicides. It's the third leading cause of death for young people between the ages of 15 and 24. 12th leading cause of death overall in the United States. And here's the thing. Suicidal thoughts are not abnormal. Suicidal thoughts are symptoms that are treatable. What is abnormal is acting on those thoughts. Many people think about suicide when they find themselves in a rut, but don't act on it because they have time and they wake up tomorrow and say, you know what? Okay, I lost my job, or I broke up with my significant other, or whatever happened, but I can do better tomorrow. Time is our friend in that situation. But most people need to talk about it. Less than half the people, I think the most recent statistic said, only about 46% of people in the United States who die by suicide have a diagnosed mental illness. That's less than half. Many of the people who die by suicide find themselves in a situation that they think is hopeless. And those people who survive suicide attempts have told us that it's not an issue of being mentally ill. I just need somebody to talk to. I just need somebody to care, because again, it's isolating. That stigma or whatever you're going through, we've all been there. We feel like we're the only one. We feel like we're the only one going through a breakup. We think we're the only one who lost a job. We think we're the only one who's having financial problems. We're not, but it feels like that. But most people just need to be heard. In the United States, and in 2022, we lost 49,499 people to suicide. That is the highest in US history. During the pandemic in 2019 and 2020, the numbers went down. In 21, they started to creep back up. 22, we hit a all-time high. Almost 50,000 people in the United States lost to suicide. And most people don't know this, and it's a terrible unknown fact. In the United States, we lose almost twice as many people to suicide as we do to homicide. But what do you hear about when we turn the news, 6 o'clock news on every day? It's the homicides. And we don't talk proactively about preventing suicide. Suicide is one of the most preventable causes of death that we know, if we talk about it. Not everybody needs to see a psychiatrist, not everybody needs to be on medication, not everybody needs to be on a couch, but we all need to be heard. We all need to have a sense of security. And just think about it. We talked a little bit earlier about the lack of resources, and that is a real problem. But the most significant thing we can do to increase, or let's say it a different way, to reduce the stigma associated with mental illness and to reduce death by suicide, is talk. Have the conversation at the kitchen table, at the breakfast table, at the dinner table. Have a plan. Do you know what behavioral health resources are available to you in your community? And act. If you have a concern, do something about it. Don't just wait and hope it gets better. It's probably not. So the elephant in the room, let's talk about the impact that racism has on our mental health. The fact is, and this came out right after George Floyd's situation, and it was actually the NAMI national CEO was the first person I ever heard say this: racism is a public health crisis in the United States. And while there's much we need to do about racism, we cannot ignore the impact that it has on our mental health. And we can't ignore the racial disparities, the importance. The effect of racism and racial trauma on mental health is in fact real and cannot be ignored. The disparity in access to mental health services is real and cannot be ignored. And the inequality and lack of culturally competent behavioral health care providers cannot be ignored. There is no one size fits all. And we have to recognize that. I was in Southwest Detroit last week before last, talking to primarily Hispanic community. They have the same hopes, dreams, goals that we all have, but they said we feel ignored. We have language barriers, we have access to care barriers, we have insurance barriers, we have all of those barriers. And we have to help everybody, because if we do that, then the entire community benefits. It's not just African Americans, it's not just Hispanics, the entire community benefits when we address this issue. Again, the disparities are real, and there are lots of reasons for them, and we just talked about it. Lack of access to health care, lack of awareness about the resources available to you in your community. The stigma works. Stigma is a dual-edged sword. When we talk about racial disparities, there is an issue of making behavioral health care treatment available from the outside, and then there's the issue within the community of being willing to utilize those services if they're available. We have to get past that, and that again applies to everybody, not just people of color. But we also know, I think I mentioned earlier, only about 46% of adults in mainstream America who needs mental health treatment receive it in a given year. If you're Asian American, and these are actually better numbers than last year, but Asian Americans, only about 25%. African Americans up from 33% to 39%. Multiracial, racial, 52%. Latinos up from, I think, 31 to 36%, and non-Hispanic whites, 52%. And if you're Arab American, we don't even track good data on the access or the utilization of behavioral health care resources. And I can tell you, we all know Dearborn has the largest population of Arab Americans in the country. And the stigma there is so hard. I get requests all the time from people in that community who say, can you find me a Muslim male or female provider who's not in Dearborn? Because they don't want their friends and neighbors to know. And so you talk about trying to find a needle in a haystack, and in the United States, less than 4% of all behavioral health care professionals are of color. So you try to find a Muslim, female, black psychiatrist that's not in Dearborn. You talk about finding a needle in a haystack, but I get those requests, and I do everything in my power to accommodate them. But it shouldn't have to be that way. Since 1999, the suicide rate in the United States increased for the general population by 35%. In the African American community, by over 78%. And I still speak in black churches, quite frankly, and other organizations, and I have people who say, black people don't die by suicide. Want that? Since 2018, the Centers for Disease Control has reported that the suicide rate for African American boys between the ages of 5 and 12 is twice what it is for their Caucasian counterparts. Why are our 5-year-old babies killing themselves? It just makes no sense. And, you know, it broke my heart. I live in Plymouth Township now. I have a 3.5-year-old grandson who I absolutely adore. We were at the park a few weeks ago, and he was running around. There was a family there playing, and I believe they were of Middle Eastern descent. I'm not picking on them, but there were 2 brothers, and my grandson went up to the younger, who's about his age, and said, "Hey, can I play with you? Do you want to play?" And the little boy said, "Yeah, you chase me and I'll chase you." But then his older brother came up and said, "No, you can't play with us." And my 3.5-year-old grandson, I told him, I said, "Well, here, let's just go play over here." And he said, "But why? But why? But why?" And it broke my heart, because in this day and age, we're still fighting those battles. He's 3 years old. He just wants to play. A lot of people think of suicide prevention as this really heavy conversation. We went from the 1-800 number. Last July, we implemented the national 988 number to simplify it. And 988 is a great resource. And 988 is not just for people who are at risk of harm to themselves or others. It got marketed as the new suicide prevention hotline. It's actually the crisis and suicide prevention hotline. But I'm going to say what I said earlier again. Do not wait for yourself or a loved one to be in crisis before you seek help. The earlier we address it, the better the outcomes. But suicide prevention is not an 800 number or a 988 number. Suicide prevention is food security. It's stable housing. It's affordable health care. It's mental health parity. You know, in the Clinton administration in 1996, the federal government passed what they call the Mental Health Parity Act, which said that your insurance provider had to provide you the same level of coverage for behavioral health care as it does for any other physical health care. But have you checked your policy lately? Because there's still policies out there that say you can have 6 mental health visits or 12 mental health visits. And I'm not picking on people with cancer, but could you imagine us telling a person who's diagnosed with breast cancer, You get 6 visits, and then you're on your own. You get 6 chemo treatments, you're on your own. It's not fair. And the problem is, the federal government passed the law, but they left it to the states to enforce it, and the states don't enforce it. And that's easy. The federal government did the heavy lift. All we have to do is hold the insurance providers accountable for it. But mental health or suicide prevention is all of those other social supports that we need. It's not just, do you need medication, do you need therapy, do you need a psychiatrist? Because guess what? If I'm homeless and I'm hungry and I'm being bullied on the street, the last thing I'm worried about is making my psychiatrist appointment. I got a lot of other issues I need to address first. And proactive mental health care is also a form of suicide prevention. Again, don't wait. I get really frustrated whenever we lose a celebrity to suicide, and at the end of the news report, they always say, if you know someone who's in crisis, call 988 or call this 800 number. And I use the analogy of like being at the Renaissance Center, and we're in the lobby, and you know something's wrong. Kevin's just not himself. Would you let me ride the elevator to the 71st floor, get off at the roof, take my shoes off and go stand on the ledge before you say, hey Kevin, don't jump. Call this magic number and they're gonna help you. Why not help me while we're in the lobby? That's suicide prevention. That's proactive behavioral health care. Don't let it reach crisis, because a lot of things can go bad. Unfortunately, I was out of town a few weeks ago when a young lady, they said died by suicide, by jumping off the Jeffersonian building. And I've talked to people on the behavioral health care side and law enforcement, and they said, we're not sure if she jumped or if she slipped and fell. But what if somebody had intervened before she made it to the rooftop? What if a family member or somebody said, hey, you know, Crystal, something's going on with her. Let's take her to get help. It's just me. Those are daunting statistics, but here's the hope, and here's the reality. Every year, millions of people who receive behavioral health care treatment overcome their mental health challenges and go on to live very happy, very productive lives. You see them, Demi Lovato, Beyonce, Jay-Z, there's football players, there's Kevin Love, and all of these athletes who are telling us, Simone Biles, they're telling us, yes, I've either been diagnosed with a mental illness or I've experienced something, but I have access to treatment and I'm doing better. Mental illness is not a death sentence, and I will not allow it to be stigmatized that way. Most mental illness is treatable. And look at it this way. Is it curable? I can't lie to you and tell you that. But think about this. If I suffered a heart attack right now, I hope somebody calls an ambulance, but I'm probably going to be hospitalized, right? I'm definitely going to be put on medication. And as I recover and get better, at some point, they're going to put me on some form of physical therapy. They're going to say, you got to change your diet, you got to exercise, and those things, right? And nobody stigmatizes you for that. Well, let's say I'm diagnosed with schizophrenia, and it might be so severe that I might need to be hospitalized. Schizophrenia is a chemical imbalance in the brain. It requires medication. So I will be put on medication, but they will also teach me coping skills too, so I can come back home and live as normal a life as possible. There's no difference, but we treat it differently because we stigmatize it, and we shouldn't. I'm working with a family right now, and I spoke to a young man, 20 years old. His mom called me yesterday, and he's living with depression. And he's getting to be in a pretty bad spot. I've never met him in person. But when I spoke to him, and he said, well, I'm afraid to go to the doctor because I'm afraid they're going to put me on medication. And I said, well, why? Why are you afraid of that? And he said, well, I don't want my mood to be force altered. Your mood is already altered. If you're telling me that you're having suicidal thoughts, if you're telling me you're so depressed that you can't get out of bed, your mood is already altered. And again, if you were diagnosed with heart disease or anything else, would you be feeling some kind of way about taking the medication? No, you want to live. And after we had that conversation, he said, oh, okay, I never thought of it that way. We stigmatize it because it's mental illness, and it's because we don't understand it, it's because we're afraid of it, because we don't talk about it. I remember growing up in the 70s, women didn't talk openly about breast cancer. I had an aunt who was diagnosed with breast cancer, and my mother wouldn't say the word. She would just say, Aunt so-and-so has the C word. Now we celebrate women. Angelina Jolie a few years ago proactively had a double mastectomy because breast cancer runs in her family. They threw a parade. Why can't we do the same for mental illness? I encourage you to become familiar with NAMI. I love NAMI. NAMI was life-changing and life-saving for me. NAMI provides almost 20 what we call signature programs, education and support programs in the communities that we serve at absolutely no cost to participants. We're not selling it, we're giving it away. And I wish I had known of NAMI before Dominique was diagnosed, and certainly before I lost him, because they would have taught me how to be a better caregiver. They would have taught me how to better understand what he was experiencing. I had to figure it all out on my own, and it wasn't fair, and it hurt. And I often tell people, I felt like I was in quicksand. It seemed like the harder I fought, the deeper I sank. We dads, and it's a whole separate conversation, we live with what I call toxic masculinity. We are trained to be protectors and providers. We're trained that silence is strength. We don't complain. We're not supposed to come home and say, oh honey, I'm depressed. I feel like I got the weight of the world on my shoulders. I was trying to figure it out all by myself, and I wasn't trying to be macho. I didn't know who to ask. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what resources were available. And I tried reading as much as I could, and I tried to figure out what the resources were. And I remember my wife, we were just dating at the time, and she would email me articles and links. And I remember one night I said or did something that led her to believe that I was frustrated. And I remember her asking me, she said, do you want me to stop? Is it too much? And I was like, yes. It's not that I don't want your help, I can't absorb it all. I didn't have anybody I'm reading pages and pages of articles every night, and I didn't have anybody who just said, hey Kevin, the guidance center is right down the street. Just go over there. Or community mental health is right, it's 2 blocks away. Nobody told me, and I didn't know what to ask. NAMI provides those supports in addition to the education and support programs we offer, because we are not a direct care provider. We don't employ psychiatrists, psychologists, but we are the national leading agency that connects families in need to the resources. I get calls all day. I just talked about the mother who called me yesterday with her son. I get calls all the time from people who say, I don't know where to go, I don't know who to call. And I'm privileged and I'm grateful and blessed that I can now be that resource to somebody when I didn't have it provided or available to me. So learn more about your local NAMI and get engaged and get involved. You know, Mr. Beebe mentioned we had a NAMI Walks event, which is a awareness raising and fundraising walk this past Saturday, a week ago Saturday. And it's much like the breast cancer awareness walks and Sister Strut and all of that. And here's another, and I know I'm prejudiced. I participate in breast cancer walks. I don't have breast cancer, I've never had it. But I participated for years because I want to support people who do. I remember as a kid, we used to have the March of Dimes walk at Belle Isle every year. I didn't have muscular dystrophy, but I raised money every year. I participate in the Heart Walk every year. 50,000 people will go to the breast cancer awareness walk. 25,000 people go to the Heart Walk. There's something called the Color Run that has an undefined cause, and 20,000 people will go to that. In the state of Michigan, almost 400,000 people receive behavioral health care services through the community mental health system. If you remember the data I gave you earlier, less than half of people who need services receive them. So let's double that number. And then let's talk about the ripple effect that it has on families and caregivers. So well in excess of 1 million people are impacted by mental illness every year. And I told you, more people will be diagnosed with a mental illness annually than cancer, heart disease, hypertension, all of that combined. We did great this year to have 1,000 people come to the NAMI walk. And I know people don't come because they don't want anybody to think they're crazy. I've never worried about anybody thinking I had breast cancer, but people don't come support that because they don't want anybody to think that they or somebody in their family are crazy. And that's not the point. Public displays of support will help destigmatize mental illness and encourage people to get the help that they need. I don't even care about the fundraising part. My national office hates to hear me say that. And the fundraising is important because I've mentioned before, the programming that we provide is at no cost to participants. And it costs money to put it on. It costs to print those brochures and put on a walk and all of that. But I'm more focused on increasing awareness and destigmatizing mental illness than I am about raising money. Because I know, and I've had people come up to me and say, thank you, I saw you on a news interview. You speak for me because nobody else wants to hear from me because I have a mental illness and I feel invisible. That's what it's about to me. I want to be the resource that Dominique never had. So please, learn more about your local NAMI. Not just to be engaged, we'd love to have you come volunteer, but also to learn more about the resources that are available. My wife and I started the Everybody vs. Stigma, and I call it a campaign, not just a brand, in 21, because I was increasingly frustrated with hearing about the negative impact the social distancing and not being able to go to school was having on our young people. And so my wife has a small t-shirt business literally in the basement of our house. And I said, look, print me an Everybody vs. Stigma shirt. I went to my local Meijer in Canton, and I'm the shopper in the house. And I said, I'm gonna do my normal Saturday morning shopping just to see what reaction I get. And I walked around the store for about 30 minutes, and you see people squinting and reading, but they don't want to say anything to you. And I got a little discouraged until I made it to the checkout. I was getting ready to leave, and one lady stopped me, and she says, what's stigma? And I said, well, I'm a mental health and suicide prevention advocate. And when I said something about mental illness, she said, oh, I got a nephew who's diagnosed with a mental illness, and he doesn't get help in it. And as we talked, over about less than 10 minutes, just passers-by were picking up on suicide, mental illness. We had a crowd of about 20 people blocking 2 checkout lanes because people wanted to have the conversation. And that was the whole reason I wanted the brand. So now when I'm in restaurants and airports, and people stop me all the time, and that was my intent, had to normalize the conversation. So we would encourage people to get the help that they need. Again, it's easy to say you are not alone, but you feel alone until you see somebody standing next to you and say, hey, that guy's got an Everybody vs. Stigma shirt. What's that all about? Maybe I can talk to him. Maybe he can be a resource to me. That's what it's all about. And as you can see, Senator Stabenow, that's me and Braylon Edwards and Andre Risen and some other folks who have gotten on board. And it's simple. I want to eliminate the stigma associated with mental illness because it is in fact the leading barrier that prevents people from taking the very first step to getting the behavioral health care help they need. Yes, lack of resources is an issue, but stigma is the #1 barrier. So I was gonna play another video, but I think I'm gonna skip it.
What is a C?
Oh, wow. So I wanna talk to you a little bit about resources. And the video I was going to show you, I wanted to talk about resources because most people aren't aware. In the state of Michigan, we spend over $3 billion a year on public behavioral health care. That's not all private and private insurance. That's through the community mental health system, or what we call the CMH system. There's also 10 prepaid inpatient health plans, or what we call PIHPs, like Detroit Wayne Integrated Health Network and Oakland Community Health Network and Washtenaw County. And pretty much all the large counties have those. Those are the funders for those 46 community mental health offices. We also have a new tool that I want you to remember because, again, there is stigma and then there's a lack of awareness of resources or how to access them. And one of the big concerns most people have is, can I afford high quality behavioral health care? Back in 2015, Senator Stabenow and Senator Roy Blunt, so it was a bipartisan, we live in this bizarro world where political parties can't work together. Well, Senator Roy Blunt is a Republican out of Missouri, recently retired, and Senator Debbie Stabenow, Democrat here from Michigan, created something called Certified Community Behavioral Health Centers. And for me, it is a game changer for people who live with behavioral health care challenges. It is the most significant behavioral health care legislation in our lifetime. And I know that to be true because it is usable now. It's not legislation like the Mental Health Parity Act that got passed 30 years ago and didn't get used. CCBHCs, or Certified Community Behavioral Health Centers, provide high quality behavioral health care for anyone in the community, regardless of the severity of your diagnosis, regardless of your insurance status, and regardless of your ability to pay. So we took all that off the table. And they're not long wait times. A lot of people say, well, it's taken me 6 months to get an appointment for my child. Not if you go to a CCBHC. So if you're writing it down, write down and Google when you get home, CCBHC in Michigan. I will go back for just a second and play this.
What is a CCBHC?
It's loud.
A CCBHC is a Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinic. CCBHCs provide comprehensive, high-quality, community-based behavioral health care for children, teens, adults, and seniors, getting people into care quickly with the services they need when they are needed, regardless of where they live or their ability to pay. CCBHCs also provide 24/7 crisis intervention services for people experiencing a mental health or substance use crisis. CCBHCs meet people where they are with a range of services and supports, providing access to care and transforming behavioral health systems one community at a time. To learn more, visit samhsa.gov/CCBHC.
I wanted to share that with you because unfortunately, this is the best kept secret in the country, and it absolutely should not be. Again, and I have lots of friends who are behavioral health care professionals, so I'm not taking shots at them. But many, because there's such a shortage of behavioral health care professionals, especially child psychiatrists and psychologists, they can cherry pick. They can pick and choose who their clients are going to be. And a lot of people like the path of least resistance. I don't want the really tough case. I want the mild to moderate case. I can charge whatever I want, and I can work 9 to 5 and not have the really tough cases. Well, CCBHCs can't do that. Anybody who shows up at their door, they have to provide, they are federally funded to provide treatment, and they cannot discriminate. Again, not based on the severity of your diagnosis, not on your insurance status, and not based on your ability to pay. And I was at a meeting earlier today. I sit on the board. He's actually a Wayne-Westland native. Kerry Walker and I thought he might be here tonight. He's the CEO of one of the best behavioral health, family and youth behavioral health provider agencies in the area called the Guidance Center. And we were at a meeting earlier today, and we were talking about the need to educate or inform the public on resources like this, because so many people are just unaware. It's not that we don't have, it's we don't know what we have or how to access it. And CCBHCs have to make themselves easily accessible. They have to have 24-hour crisis programs. This is a game changer as it relates, and it's not just mental illness. For people who have substance use disorder issues, it's people who are in crisis. It's a great tool to have. And again, my goal is to make sure people are aware of what those resources are that are available to them and how to access them. These are some national resources that are available. The new 24/7, 365 national mental health and crisis line is 988. NAMI has a crisis line that is a great resource that connects you. Again, there's text lines. There's lots of resources out there that we need to be aware of in case we need them. And then here's my contact information. I try to make myself as accessible. It drives my wife nuts because she says I'm like a cop. I'm never off duty. But I love the work that I do. Frankly, I hate the way I got here. But I love the opportunity, again, to be a resource to people that I needed so badly when Dominique was diagnosed. So I thank you for your time and attention this evening, and I think we have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, and you can pretty much ask me anything. I'm very informal and I'm pretty open, but please feel free to ask any questions that you might have. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. What is the best way, we talked about stigma and that kind of thing. What is the best way, besides talking, to get through to our baby boomers that don't believe in mental health?
That is a great question. Mr. Beebe and I were talking about it earlier. Our parents' generation would not be having a conversation about mental illness. It was
Definitely not.
suck it up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, rub some dirt on it, get back out there. That doesn't work. And unfortunately, my mom is 92. And this is all still really new to her. And I still don't think she fully understands the work or the depth of the work that I do, but I know she's gained an appreciation for it. And she'll call me and say, hey, I saw you on the news today, or what about this, or her, and she's even said, I gotta have one of those shirts. So, it's a cultural shift, and that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about changing culture. Some won't adjust. I'm one of those people who believes in, you're grateful for the people who listen and who do come along. I speak at senior centers as well. And this may sound weird, I love my elders and I love talking to older people. I love getting that wisdom. I'm actually encouraged when I go to senior centers and talk. They are as receptive as our kids are. And I'm really surprised by that. They're really, and they ask hard questions. Well, what about this? I was at a place out in Allen Park a few weeks ago, and there was a resident who asked me how to overcome her fear. She was afraid, she had a slip and fall in the shower, and so she's afraid to take showers. And so after the group presentation, I sat down and talked to her, and I said, help me understand the challenge. Tell me, be more specific. And we had a really pleasant conversation, and I actually pulled somebody from the staff at the facility into the conversation. And basically, we worked out a plan by which someone would personally assist her for a period of time while she took a shower every day. And I actually got a call back where they said she's coming along really nicely, but her question was, how do I overcome that fear? And so we just have to keep talking to them. One of the things that we do, NAMI has a great program, and it's an anti-stigma program called Ending the Silence we do in the schools. And I don't know if I mentioned to you before, or it was a conversation I had before, parents, I say this with love and respect. We are more the perpetuators of the stigma than our children are. Our young people, I spend a lot of time in junior and senior high schools and college campuses. They are very open about these conversations. They will, after a presentation like this, I've had young people come up to me and they've told me, yes, I've survived a suicide attempt. Yes, I'm on medication. Yes, I've abused substances. I've had young men come up to me, football players, who pull their sleeves up and show me where they've been cutting. And they say, but my parents don't want me to get help because they don't want the neighbors and the coworkers and the people we sit next to at church to know about it. So we're more the perpetuators than our young people are. And we actually, we incentivize young people to go home and initiate the conversation with their parents. So I have no shame. I will, when I say meet you where you are, I will. And if it's giving a kid a $10 Starbucks card to go home and have a conversation with their parents, I do it. But that's how we have to have those conversations. And sometimes, I love young people too. I've mentioned before, I learned a lot from my son. I'm learning things from my 3-year-old grandson. We have to be receptive and listen. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
If you feel like you're supposed to be doing something as an advocate for ending the stigma of mental health issues, there's so many different areas people can go into. How do you know where you might fit, and how do you go forth when you're still dealing with your own possible mental health issues in your family or yourself?
Great question. If you didn't hear, she said, how do you become an advocate when you're still facing challenges of your own? I say very carefully, because this is not for everybody. I meet people all the time, and I have people come up to me after presentations and they say, I want to do what you're doing. This is not for everybody. This hurts. I relive every day losing my son. Every single day of my life, I relive it. But for me, it works because it's therapeutic. When I was keeping it inside, I started having thoughts of self-harm. And in full transparency, about 6 months after I lost Dominique, I started planning my own suicide. But I wouldn't talk to my wife, and I went to therapy. I joined, there's a national organization called Compassionate Friends. It's specifically for parents who lost children. I did the things that I thought I needed to be doing outside the house. But at home, I had 3 other children. And I said, they need to see strong dad. They need to see dad who's helping them with homework and getting them off to school in the morning and all of those things. And so I internalized a lot. It wasn't until I started talking that I realized how therapeutic it was for me. So as hard as it is for me to stand before you tonight and have this conversation, it really helps me to do that. Now, to be an advocate, you can be an advocate in many, many ways. And NAMI has a program called NAMI Smarts for Advocacy. Again, it is free to participate in. And it helps people kind of develop where they best fit in advocacy. Not all of us are cut out to do this, but you can be an advocate for your family, in your house, and at the same time, you can still be receiving treatment. I know, most therapists have therapists. I have the privilege of working with Director Elizabeth Hertel, who's the director for the Department of Health and Human Services. Liz is very public about her husband is a politician, and I think she has 3 children. She said, we all have therapists. It's okay. Therapy does not mean you're broken. As a matter of fact, one of my best experiences, I started therapy in 1999 or 2000. I was going through some personal issues at work. And therapy, it wasn't what I expected, but it was one of the best things I ever engaged in. Because it wasn't about the therapist giving me the answers. It was helping me work through the issues. And he was helping me discover, kind of create my own roadmap. One of the fastest growing opportunities, and I think it can help us address the issue of shortage of behavioral healthcare professionals, is peer support specialists now. There are a lot of people with lived experience, whether it is with mental illness or substance use, who can be trained to help people who are walking that same journey. I mentioned before, I've never done drugs or alcohol. So there's some people who say, well, you have no credibility as a substance use counselor when you never had a problem. I never served in the military. Again, so there are veterans who say, what credibility do you have to talk to me about treatment of PTSD when you never served? And that's why I get back to when we talk about meeting people where they are, we have to be authentic and honest about that. And peer supports are a great way to do that. So you can live in those dual roles or dual world, but again, my recommendation is do what you're comfortable. Don't try to do too much. Because the worst thing that can happen is you can jump in too fast and take on too much, and it can be damaging to your mental health as well. Yes, ma'am.
I got something really interesting also about what you said, though. It's kind of like either way, you're still living with what happened.
Mhm.
And because he's still alive in you,
Mhm.
you still deal with it one way or another, but you've chosen to deal with it in a way that would benefit others and you at the same time. That makes any sense?
Yes,
As opposed
no.
to just kind of keeping it inside and dealing with it, on your own and not sharing.
I will be very blunt and honest. I truly, and I truly believe this to the depth of my heart. If I wasn't doing this work, I think I'd be dead. This is truly my therapy. This is what works for me. I have a therapist, yes, but the work is as therapeutic for me as any counseling session. That was my choice. It was do this or die, because I didn't, and again, I am one of those people who can tell you, I've never wanted to die. There's a difference in wanting to die and experiencing suicidal ideation. And I just didn't want to live with the pain anymore. And there's a difference in not wanting to live with that pain and dying. But my choice was do this. And my wife, she's, again, I was in therapy and I was going to support groups and it just wasn't working. And my wife didn't know until probably 2 years after. She was actually sitting in an auditorium at Western Michigan University. 2 years later was the first time I'd ever publicly disclosed that I had planned to take my life. She didn't know. And she didn't know how much she was helping me at the time either. So it's, I still say I'm in recovery. I was having a conversation like this a few years ago at a high school, and a father, and here's how interesting stigma is. Father had a question for me that he didn't want to ask in the public, so he literally followed me in the bathroom. And his question was, he said, you mentioned that you experienced suicidal ideation. And he said, once you experience, are you always suicidal? And then nobody had ever asked me that question before, and the answer was no. I've not thought about taking my life since then. I still struggle. I have very dark days. The last few days are tough for me. My wife and family were out of town on a trip, and I tell people all the time, idle time is not my friend. It's not good for me, because I do still live with depression, and I slip back into things, and I'm tremendously blessed. And I'm gonna say this to the guys in the audience, let's give up the toxic masculinity. Let's have conversations with our significant others. Because my wife is my greatest sense of support, and she'll call me. She knows, she's heard me say enough that I don't like spending a lot of time alone. So she'll call me for trips, and I know she doesn't say anything. She doesn't, are you okay? But I know she's checking on me, and I appreciate it. And there's times that I pick up the phone and I call her and I say, you know what? Today's not a good day. Today Dominique's on my mind, heavier than it. Last night on social media I posted, and I literally stopped some things that I was going to say, because I said coming here today was going to be hard. This is home. Dominique grew up here. Dominique played football right out here on John Glenn football field. And so I knew today was going to be hard, but I also knew it was going to be therapeutic too. I think you were going to ask a question.
No, I see it
Oh.
right in the corner.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
I just moved here for the door, to let people in. I just wanna, it wasn't so much a question as a statement of, thank you for your advocacy and for reminding me as a parent, my son, we deal with ADHD and anxiety through him. And it's a battle, and I'm not trying to compare my battle to yours, but thank you for reminding me to, meet him where he's at, rather than meet him with my frustration of where I wish he was. So thank you.
No, you're very welcome. I was a part of a local high school. I do this a lot. And what's really impressive to me is that there are high schools, young people who are starting their own mental health clubs. And so a local high school, not far from here, reached out to me, and I do something with them every May, because May is National Mental Health Awareness Month. And I had a young lady, we were doing a virtual session, I think it was 2 years ago,
And there was a young lady there who said that she had known since she was in the 7th grade that she had some sort of mental health issue. And she said she'd gone to her parents repeatedly saying, you know, asking for help. And she said routinely, and she mentioned her mom, I don't know if dad was in the house or not, but she said routinely her mom would always just kind of brush it off and say, oh, you know, you're just being dramatic, you're just having a bad day, it'll be okay tomorrow. And she said one night she was in the 10th grade, and she said she was experiencing some pretty heavy suicidal thoughts. And before she went to bed, she said she tried to talk to her mom again and said, look, you really need to take me to see somebody. And once again, her mom said, you'll be fine, we'll talk about it tomorrow. And she said she literally grabbed her mom's hand and said, I might not be here tomorrow. And that's what it took to get her mother's attention. And her mom did take her and got her help. And when I met her, she was graduating and going off to college. And she said, I've never felt better about myself. She said, I know what it is. She said, I'm in treatment, I take medication, but she said, I've never been in a better place in my life. Parents, imagine how hard and how much courage it would take for your child to come to you and say, hey, mom, dad, I'm having dark thoughts, or I'm depressed, or I'm being bullied. It takes so much courage for them to do that. We can't dismiss them. We can't just sweep it under the rug and say, oh, it'll be okay tomorrow. If they have the courage to ask for help, we have to have the courage to get it. And ladies and gentlemen, this is above your pay grade. I mean, let's just be honest. I work with Detroit Police, and they have a teen cadet program, and I present to about 1,000 kids every summer. And again, I think it was 2 summers ago, I was presenting. There was an officer there who had just left the scene of a horrific child abuse situation where a very young child died. And she, one of the other officers had pulled me aside and said, hey, you know, when you're done, can you go talk to her? She's really struggling today. And I always have to be careful because I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, and I tell people that's above my pay grade. I think I'm a good listener, but I don't try to pretend to be smarter than I am. But what was really interesting is when I went and talked to this officer, she didn't talk to me about the accident that she had witnessed earlier that morning. She talked to me about her teenage daughter, who the officer had just recently lost her husband to cancer. And she said, my daughter was daddy's little girl, and she's really, really struggling. And she said her daughter had come to her multiple times saying, I need to talk to somebody. But the mother says, no, I'm a cop. I'm trained in de-escalation. I'm this, and this. And I said, respectfully, above your pay grade. If your daughter worked up the courage to ask you for help, you have a responsibility to get her that help. Doesn't mean you're a bad parent. We just have to recognize resource. You know, Mike, I was not a baseball player. And Bud Somerville, the city, I got to acknowledge Bud. When my family moved back to Michigan from Ohio in '97, Bud was the unit director for WYAA Sports. And he welcomed my family and gave my youngest son an opportunity to play baseball. He was younger than he was supposed to be, but Bud gave him an opportunity. I worked with my kids. I knew nothing about baseball, nothing about pitching. I was a basketball, football guy. I couldn't hit a fast pitch to save my life. But my kids got really interested in baseball. So this is back in the late 90s before we had YouTube and all that. So I went to the local library and rented videos and books on pitching. And I taught myself everything I could so I could teach my kids. But I got to a point where I said, their ability has exceeded my ability to teach or coach them anymore. And so I went and hired them a pitching coach. It was above my pay grade. The same thing, we should have conversations with our children. And like I said, not everybody needs to be on the couch and not everybody needs medication, but we should be talking to our children. And we should listen to them. And don't just listen to answer or to respond. Listen to them because their feelings are genuine. They're their own, whether you agree with them or not. So, yes, ma'am.
In addition to that, I believe it definitely goes both ways. I think that it's the child's responsibility as well to notice that their parents are going through something or whatnot, and notice that aspect to get them help.
I'm in my second marriage, so my wife and I both had 2 children from our first marriage. My daughter, I don't like the term stepchildren, I call them my new kids. My daughter, I came into her life when she was about 12 years old. And when Dominique passed, she probably saw more emotion in me than anybody. And there were days that she would say, "You okay?" You know, or she'll say, or she would just say, "Can we go for a walk? Or can we go for an ice cream?" And it wasn't an ice cream for her, the ice cream was for me. So you're right, we have to lead by example. We talk about that at work a lot, but we need to do that at home too. We have to model the behavior that we expect our children to exhibit. It's one thing to say it and another thing to do it. So, any others? Yes, ma'am.
Where can we buy your shirts?
Everybodyversusstigma.com.
Thank you.
Yep. And thank you. And again, I do this because I created the brand because I wanted to start the conversation. I will tell you, and I have people who email me and DM me and stuff all the time. And it's like every time I wear a shirt, I get stopped. So be prepared to get stopped. And somebody asks you about it. And like I said, I didn't do this to make money. I did this because we need to change the culture. We need to change the way we need to destigmatize mental illness. One last really quick thing. I was at an event at Northville Public Schools a week and a half ago. I do a lot of events, so it's hard for me to keep up. But there's a film called Death Is Not the Answer, and it's an it's a suicide prevention documentary. And in that documentary, there is a psychiatrist who said that he thinks it's going to be 25 years before we can have an impact in terms of reducing the suicide rate in this country. That is absolutely unacceptable to me, and I don't believe it. And again, I'm not talking about money, I'm not talking about psychiatrists and psychologists and psych beds. I truly believe if we destigmatize mental illness and suicide prevention and just have the conversation, we can have a significant impact much sooner than 25 years. So yeah, go out and buy a shirt and be ready to have a conversation. And I'll be honest, it makes me feel good. I look forward to people stopping me and asking me because I know they need the help. Hey, we're 3 minutes under allowed. So again, thank you sincerely for being here tonight. You didn't have to be here, you could be somewhere else. This shows how important this issue is to you. I look forward to having a similar conversation with the students. If you have any concerns, there's Mr. Beebe. You know, I do this a lot. We don't traumatize the kids. The idea behind this conversation is not to scare anybody. I'm not a fear monger. I want to educate people because this impacts so many lives. And I just want people, again, to know that it's okay to get help, and if they need help, how to get to those resources. And if you go to NAMI.org or Everybody Versus Stigma, we are continuously trying to increase the resources that are there. But if you contact your local NAMI, they will connect you to local resources. So again, thank you very much for your time and attention tonight.
Can we give Kevin a round of applause one more time? That was such a powerful presentation. Thank you so much. So once again, on behalf of Wayne-Westland, we really appreciate Kevin Fisher spending time with us on tonight. I'm super grateful to our board president Cox and our superintendent Dr. Dignan also for allowing us to host this evening. And so we're looking forward to, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have Kevin come back and talk to our students at the Comprehensive High School to answer the question. We're also working on Wayne-Westland versus Stigma shirts. And so we're just going to continue to keep the movement going to speak against the stigma around mental health and to also promote suicide prevention. So once again, on behalf of Wayne-Westland Community Schools, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Have a good night.